be here. I always come when I'm asked to be here, and it's not just out of it's not a sense of obligation. I came here a few years ago and met a couple of people who I've remained good friends with, including Athina and her sister Athina, who invited me here in the first place. I recognize some of you from previous screenings, so it's nice to see you again. I know the discussion here is usually very good. People have strong opinions. I can understand the strong opinions when they're in English. This gentleman clearly had a very strong opinion, which I would have translated for me later. It sounded very funny. I wish I had heard it. And you know, all the movies that I've come here to talk about, I've been interested to. I wouldn't come talk about a movie if I wasn't interested in it. But I was particularly interested to come talk about Attenberg for a few reasons. It's kind of a less famous movie than some of the other movies I've talked about here. I talked about Unforgiven by Clint Eastwood. I'm not saying you have to like it, but it's an Oscar winner. It's sort of a classic. I talked about last time Inside Llewyn Davis by the Coen brothers, and you also don't have to like that movie. Some people didn't like that movie, but the Coens are American filmmakers. They're very strong. People know their cinema. It's about a part of history and a part of American culture that's very famous. And then we have a movie like Attenberg, which for a lot of people, even people who see movies for a living, was an unusual film because it's a Greek film. And there aren't that many Greek films. Or rather, there aren't that many Greek films that come to North America. And there certainly haven't been that many Greek films in the last 15 or 20 years. I'm not an expert on Greek society or the economy, but you know that Greek society has had a tough go of things in the last 15 or 20 years because of the economy. Greece is a country where almost all the money for making films comes from national organizations, from government organizations, from the film school there. And in the same way that there's been no money to do anything else in Greece, there's been no money for social programs, there's been no money for infrastructure, there's been major loss of jobs, there's been almost no money to make movies. This gentleman very smartly mentioned Theo Angelopoulos, who's the most famous Greek filmmaker of all time, a filmmaker who Athina Tsangari, by the way, hates. She hates his work and sees herself and the filmmakers who she works with as trying to change Greek cinema. But Angelopoulos is probably the last Greek filmmaker. Angelopoulos and maybe Costa Gavras were the last Greek filmmakers to play over here in North America at all, and to make the sort of films that anyone would notice or anyone would pay attention to. So that makes Attenberg unusual. And then there's the fact that it's just a very unusual movie. And I should say that I recognize the movie in what all of you have said. I think parts of it are tedious. I think aspects of it are absurd. I find aspects of it very beautiful. I think it is very much, when you were talking about white and blue as the colors of Greece, it is representative of something nationally. I think it is very much about disconnect from society, a story about a father, daughter, a story about two women. What I'm saying is you guys all seem to have watched the same movie, even if you had different reactions to it. Now, I saw Attenberg in 2011 at the Toronto International Film Festival. I wasn't one of the first people to see it because it had showed in Venice already, and it won an award in Venice, Best Actress for the lead Ariane Lebed. But I was one of the first people in the world to do a long interview with Athina Tsangari about the film. And I know this because I interviewed her at the film festival, and we sat down. She said, I really haven't talked about this movie before, or I haven't really talked about this movie at length. So that was one of those interviews for me as a journalist that I actually have created a friendship with the filmmaker as a result. You don't do that with every film that you write about. You don't do that with everyone you interview, but Athina's become a good friend, and I told her I was coming to do this tonight. She's in Rotterdam showing her new film. She just thought the idea of this was great. She's like, so you're telling me that all these people are coming here on a Saturday night to watch my movie? And I said, yes. She said, did anyone pay for the movie? I said, no. She said that that's fine. She wishes everybody, you know, her best, even if you don't like the film. And then this past September at TIFF, when she was here with her new film, a very interesting movie called Chevalier, which is set on a boat. It's all about men. This is a movie that's largely about women. Her new film, Chevalier, is all about men. They're all set on a boat, and they have this kind of weird competition with each other. When she was here, we had another long interview. We sat for almost 90 minutes just talking. And one of the things we talked about was whether she fits or not, or how she thinks she fits in this idea of the new Greek cinema. And that's a label that's been attached to movies not only by Athina Tsangari, the director of Attenberg, but also movies by her friend and producer Yorgos Lanthimos, who made Dogtooth, the film that you mentioned, and a couple of other directors in their circle, and then a lot of Greek filmmakers who've imitated them in the last few years. because when a national cinema starts being exported to North America, they look at the movies that do well, they look at Dogtooth, they look at Attenberg, and they copy them. So there have been a lot of Greek films that have kind of copied these movies since they came out. Now Athina, who has a very strong personality, you might have guessed that based on this movie, that she's not a shy person, and she's not a very neutral person, she's a very strong-minded person. She hates the idea of the new Greek cinema. She doesn't think such a thing exists. She doesn't think that there's a movement. She doesn't think that there's any kind of national identity. She just sees it as people making movies kind of on their own. She sees it as a very solitary thing because no one helps anybody. Everyone's competing for the same money. Everyone's competing for the same resources. She thinks that the new Greek cinema is something for lazy critics to do. It's a way to sort of say, yep, all these movies are coming from one country at the same time. That must mean something. She doesn't think it means anything. And she prefers for the films to be taken on their own terms instead of compared to films by other people. Now, in the case of Attenberg, I'm actually very sympathetic to what she's saying. I have a hard time comparing this movie. It's kind of my job to compare movies. It's the way that I think normally. But in the case of this movie, I don't think it's easy to compare to too much else. I think it's a very singular movie. I think it makes some viewers uncomfortable in various ways, and not just because it's sexually explicit. I assume nothing about the comfort level of any audience. Some of you may not have cared about that at all, and others of you might have thought that it was sort of shocking how blunt or how forward or how risque or how explicit it is. It's also a film that has a very odd sense of humor. So some people find parts of it very funny and other people find parts of it very tedious. Sometimes it's the exact same part of the movie that one person laughs at hilariously and another person wishes would just end. It's a movie about a very awkward, unsocialized protagonist. She's an unusual young woman, whatever else you think of her. She's an odd character. She kind of knows that she's odd. You might say one of the things that this movie is about is someone recognizing how strange she is and wondering how she got to be that way and whether she should do something about it, whether she should become more like other people or stay more like herself. And she has difficulty interacting with the world on conventional terms. Certainly, even within this remote town, this isolated town, this town of people who none of them seem to be terribly happy, she's an outlier. She seems to be an outcast of sorts, even within this outcast town. And this seems to stem from her very unusual relationship with her father. And it's a daughter-father relationship that I would say is more intimate and in some ways more possessive, and to use a word that they use in their conversations in the movie, a little more taboo. You remember that dialogue exchange where they're talking about taboo, than we usually see in movies. I'll talk about their relationship in a minute because I think it's very odd. It's also a film that looks pretty critically at the realities of living in an economically depressed town. That sense of loneliness, that sense of isolation, this gentleman was saying that in some ways he found that, the gentleman in the back was saying he found that possibly universal, that it doesn't have to be Greece, it could be a remote part of Canada, and I agree with you. I think it's very specifically about Greece, but it's also more generally about living in a small town, feeling cut off from civilization. Now, Athina says her movies are not about Greece. She says that her movies are not allegories for Greece, they're not stories about where Greece is now, but I kind of disagree with her. Because to me, the environment you see being depicted in Attenberg suggests a larger social reality of a country that is kind of crumbling, and of a country that has been there for a long time, maybe the longest time of any country, of any civilization, and time is now passing it by. And because it shows this aspect of Greek life so unflatteringly, I should say that this is a film that is resented in Greece, even though it is welcomed and embraced by critics in North America and Europe. Athina Tsangari is one of the most successful Greek filmmakers of the last 30 years, and her movies do not get good notices in Greece, and people really dislike them. Sometimes we have that same issue with Iranian filmmakers for different reasons, having to do with censorship, where there are more heroes abroad than they are at home. In Canada, we have a version of that, except that we don't like our own filmmakers here very much. We wait till they win awards in the States, and then we decide that they're important. But Athina's certainly got a bit of a chip on her shoulder about how her films go down in Greece. People don't like them. So what I want to do tonight is talk about Attenberg briefly and interpretively. I want to interpret it just a bit, because I know you guys will do the rest, and I want to leave space for it. I never like having the last word on anything. I want to say what I think it's doing is a portrait of a strange, but to me very relatable young woman. I am not a young woman myself, and yet I relate to this character. I relate to aspects of this character. To me, the key to this movie begins with its title. I think it has one of the best titles of any movie I've ever seen. It is one of my favorite titles, and the accurate way of representing the title is all capital letters. Athina gets very mad when she sees the title of the film written in lowercase. It's supposed to be Attenberg capital. The title's very important to her. Attenberg is a malapropism. It's a wrong word. It's a nonsense word. It's a made-up word derived from the name of David Attenborough, the English broadcaster and naturalist whose long-running television series has helped introduce audiences around the world to the mysteries and wonders of the animal kingdom. And you must have noticed that David Attenborough's show is in the movie. They spend a lot of time watching David Attenborough. That's where the title Attenberg comes from. It's like a weird way of saying David Attenborough's name. In 2001, Athina told me that she was shown the television series by a friend who said to her, "You gotta watch this show's great." And she said, "Okay." And that she watched it on DVD while she was also watching movies by great directors like Buñuel and Bresson. So what she was doing was she was watching a Buñuel film and then watching an episode of David Attenborough and then watching Bresson and then watching an episode of David Attenborough, and that was sort of her viewing for like 2 solid weeks. And instead of diminishing the show and making the show seem bad, she said that this juxtaposition unlocked something, she said, existential about the television show. She actually thought the television show belonged as the same kind of great art in its way as the movies that she was watching by these European masters. She said, and I'm quoting her from an interview that we did together for a magazine called CinemaScope, "My God, humans were just another species, utterly alien, incomprehensible, and spectacular. I suddenly felt that I'm part of this species, but if I extract myself from my civilized context without a soothing voice explaining to me who I am destined to be, this soothing voice, be it God or Bresson, I am just another slug or donkey or an Andalusian goat," end quote. So what Athina is saying when she said that is watching that series didn't make her feel different from the animals that David Attenborough is talking about. She felt like she was one of them. And she sort of felt that if there wasn't a David Attenborough telling her what kind of animal she was and what her behavior was and what her instincts were and what she wanted, she would feel very confused. She said it made her relate to the animals that she was watching the documentary about. Now that you've seen Attenberg, you can see some of the ways that that feeling got expressed in the movie, because we have long scenes of characters in this movie watching animals on television and wanting to act more like them. So that comes out of something Athina really did. She didn't imitate animals while she was watching the show, but it's what made her think to put these scenes in the movie. My feeling is that Attenberg follows in the spirit of David Attenborough. I think the film doesn't just take his name as a funny title. I think the film is kind of a tribute to David Attenborough and a way of doing the same thing David Attenborough does through different means. It's not a documentary and it's not about animals. It's a fiction film and it's about human beings. But I think it's very similar. I think it's a kind of anthropological study. I think it's a study of the human animal or a study of the human organism. I think superficially the film is a bit cold and clinical, which might account for why you guys might have found it tedious or unpleasant or hateful or nasty. I don't disagree. But I think it's also very empathetic, and I think it's very perceptive about the human animal and about people. I think it sees them very clearly, and I think that there's emotion in it and warmth. I don't find it cold in the end. It's a character study of an unusual individual, and it kind of takes stock of how she reacts inside her environment. Sometimes she reacts against her environment. And it also shows how she's defined sort of within her family unit and against her family unit. A lot of things are going on, even though there's not a lot of plot in the movie. There's a lot of dynamics going on. And just as Marina and her father watch the television documentaries and find themselves drawn to and identifying with the exotic species that they're watching, Tsangari is asking us to feel close to her characters, not despite their odd behaviors, but because of them. I think that in those scenes where the characters are acting ridiculous, where the characters are being physical, where the characters are being strange, I don't think she's asking us to look at them and feel distant from them. I think she's asking us to look at them and feel close to them. I'm not saying you have to. You may not have felt that way. But I think that that's how the movie is trying to work, to have us recognize some aspect of ourselves in them, just as they recognize some aspect of themselves in the animal on television. She may not have succeeded for all of us. She obviously didn't succeed for some of you. But I think Attenberg is a fascinating film because it tries to make some aspects of life that we take for granted seem very strange. I think it tries to make some things that we think are strange seem very normal. I think it tries to do those two things simultaneously and ends up with a really interesting approach to storytelling. Now, as I said, Athina does not like it when her work gets compared to other Greek films. This isn't because she's arrogant. It's because she really doesn't think the movies have a lot in common. She's very sincere. She says this all the time. I don't think that she's lying. But a little bit of context with the new Greek cinema, which I mentioned, is important. And I do want to bring up one other title, which you mentioned already, and you were right to mention it because it's an important one. And I think it is a companion piece to Attenberg, even if she disagrees, especially because Athina produced it and helped to make it. And that's a movie called Dogtooth. Have any of you seen Dogtooth?
Yeah.
A couple of you. By a director named Yorgos Lanthimos, who's actually in this film. He's the boyfriend. He's the young man. So the director of Dogtooth is an actor in this movie. Dogtooth remains the most popular and widely seen title of the new Greek cinema. It's actually one of the most sort of influential art house movies of the last 10 years, I would say. It's a big deal movie if you haven't seen it. It's been widely imitated, and not just by Greek filmmakers. It's a bizarre film about a suburban family where the father has raised the kids with the help of his wife in a way where they have no knowledge of the outside world. They think that there is no world outside their house, or that the world outside their house is a much stranger, scarier, more dangerous place than it actually is. They think that civilization's boundaries are only in their house, and that everything outside, like planes and the cat that lives next door and other people, are a terrifying threat, so they have to stay inside. He's also taught them a weird language that confuses words with ideas. Words don't mean what they're supposed to mean. Ideas don't mean what they're supposed to mean. And he uses this isolation to exploit his children. He exploits them emotionally, and he exploits them sexually. There's explicit incest within this movie, between the kids and between the parent and his kids. It's gross. It's also kind of funny. You have to see it, trust me. As the film goes along, this regime that he has set up gets toppled by circumstance. Things start happening outside his control, and the kids get wise to the fact that something else is going on. And then the children sort of revolt and topple his regime a little bit. It's a truly scary movie, and it's a very funny critique of fascist philosophy. It's a critique of fascism. It's a critique of authoritarianism filtered through the idea of the family unit. It's the idea that fascism starts at home with your father. And you know, if that's what you learn when you're at home, you're not going to understand how to deal with the world outside. So that's Dogtooth. Now, Attenberg, which came out a year later, and which Athina wrote while she was working as a producer on Dogtooth, so there is a relationship between the movies, is also about the effects of growing up with an unconventional father. But Spiros, the dad in this movie, is not a villain like the patriarch in Dogtooth, or at least I don't think he's a villain. I don't think he's a bad guy. I think he's a weird guy, but I don't think that he's a bad guy. This is a guy, Spiros, who loves his daughter, and he's raised her according to a slightly less crazed set of principles and beliefs. And these are principles and beliefs that have some intellectual and philosophical integrity. And yet, to be honest, they have left his daughter pretty stunted and unprepared for everyday life. I mean, that's literally where the movie begins, with her not feeling like she's a normal person. She wants to be more normal. As in Dogtooth, the theme is the effect that parenting has on children. And what happens when the hardwired instincts you have as a young person, your desire for sex, your desire for companionship, your desire for independence, bumps up against the kind of orthodoxy that you grow up with in your youth. There's a really strong theme here, even if it's presented in a strange way, which is like, what happens when you stop believing your dad? What happens when you stop believing your parents? What happens when you're compelled biologically in an animal way to want things that you've been taught are bad, like in her case, sex, which is sort of what the story of the movie is. You could call Attenberg a coming-of-age film. I think what's interesting is that she's having some of the experiences that you might expect to have as a teenager, but she's having them in her early 20s. It's a kind of delayed development, or an arrested development. She's like a 13 or a 14-year-old girl in some ways, even though she's 23 or 24, and that's a definite recipe to get yourself in trouble. Marina is odd. Despite being beautiful as the film begins, she's never been kissed. This is not weird in and of itself. I'm not exercising judgment one way or another about that. Different cultures and different societies have different, rules and codes about this sort of stuff. But, clearly she's not like her friend Bella. Her friend Bella is kind of the exact opposite, even though they're close friends. She is far more sexually experienced than Marina is. And we see that Marina envies and looks up to Bella because of her knowledge in this area. I mean, Marina's inexperience stems from this sheltered lifestyle, a view of life and of humanity passed down from her father, who's taught her to distrust and kind of to dislike other people. She's got that from her dad. And this misanthropy has kept her from getting close to others, except for Bella. Bella's sort of the only person that she hangs out with. These two girls hang out together and don't spend any time with anybody else. And as the film opens, though, I don't think Marina's very happy with this. She's starting to feel stifled. She sort of seems to want more. She, in the first scene, asks Bella for kissing lessons. I love this sequence. I think this scene is very funny. And it's a very suggestive scene in a couple of different directions. For one thing, here's two very attractive women kissing. The first shot of the movie is two women doing that, which has a certain pandering quality or leering quality. It might make you wonder what kind of movie you're watching. But Tsangari is a female director. She's not pandering. I think she's making fun of that idea because she shoots it as clinically and sort of comically as possible. It's not sexy in the least. Again, it's a gray wall, a bare wall, and the focus is on awkwardness. It's not erotic. It's very mechanical and very silly, and they're not really enjoying themselves. And Marina's not acting out of desire. She's not attracted to Bella. It's like she's learning a life skill. Like, this is a lesson. He actually asks her for a lesson and says, can you teach me how to do this? The key line here, and I think like the title of the film, the first or second line in the movie is really important, is how do people do it? That's what she asks Bella. She says, how do people do it? And I think that that could be Maria's motto, and I think it's kind of the movie's motto. This is someone who is constantly wondering how other people live their life, and if that's how they're living their life, is that the way she's supposed to do it too? And as the movie goes along, she goes from having this question answered only by her father, the question, how do people do it, and getting the answer from her dad, and she starts to learn to determine it for herself, I think is one of the things that the movie is about. So Maria's initial confusion about life, about what people do and why they do it and how they do it, stems from the lessons she gets from her father, which are quite cynical and unforgiving. You used the word nihilistic, and I would agree with you. There's a certain nihilism to Spiros's philosophy. I'm not sure that that's the movie's philosophy, but Spiros is kind of the voice of authority in this movie, and so there is a nihilistic aspect to what he says. It's a crucial detail that his character, what was his job? Anyone remember his job in the movie? What he said he used to be? He's an architect, and that's crucial. He literally helped to build the town, and by extension, the society that he lives in. You know, it's not a coincidence that they make him an architect. It's a significant job, thematically. And as his life has crept towards death, he's come to see that nothing lasts, and that everything he's worked on is fated to be in ruins. I haven't seen the movie in about a year, but I think he uses the word ruin to describe, what does he say exactly? Does anyone remember? He says something like everything is in ruins, or everything here is a ruin. The use of the word ruins in a Greek film is not accidental. This film has a sort of end of civilization or late civilization vibe, and no civilization is older or has more to answer for in a good or bad way than Greece. You know, we think of Greece in terms of the ruins of the past. Now we see Greece as the ruins of the present. And Spiros is a ruin as well. I mean, he's falling apart. He's barely standing, and as the movie goes on, he gets worse and worse and worse. And the question is whether this dying guy has wisdom to pass on, or if he's only passing on bad vibes to his daughter and bad advice, or if wisdom and bad vibes are kind of one and the same thing, if he's right to be telling her that life is so bad. On the one hand, his willingness to be so serious with his daughter and talk about her feelings suggests that he cares about her. But I don't know how all of you felt. There's also something very inappropriate about their conversations, or seemingly inappropriate about their conversations, especially the way that they talk about sex. And there's that long conversation where she's asking him sort of all about sex, and they're talking about the word taboo, the concept taboo, and they end up dropping the subject, possibly because Tsangari wants us to see, however, subtly a suggestion of incest between them. I don't mean that this is a movie that they really want to get it on with each other, but it's underneath what they're talking about, and it's kind of a logical extension of speaking so openly. If you talk openly about everything, that stuff comes up. And I don't know if we're supposed to be admirable about that relationship between them, or find it weird, or somewhere in between. And this idea ties into the fact that they're obsessed with nature documentaries, because Attenberg's voice tells us that nature has no taboos, and that animals follow their instincts. And so in some ways, as people, they talk about how they talk about taboos, and then animals supposedly don't have them. Animals just exist in a state of nature, and anything they do is permissible, whereas people have, these other problems. So Marina is caught between two instincts. She's caught between the instinct to look after her father, which is a very animalistic instinct, a very biological thing. We're all hardwired to care about our family. Parents care about their children. We care about our parents. And then her attraction to this young engineer who arrives in town. I think he's a very funny character. I like that he shows how tough he is by beating her at foosball. I mean, it's a really silly scene, but it's funny. Played by, as I said, the director of Dogtooth. I asked Athina when I interviewed her if she thought the film was a love triangle with Marina between her father and the newcomer. And she said that she actually saw it more like a Western. It's about a stranger coming to town who brings something new with him and kind of threatens the established order, and sort of the question of what the town is going to do about it. The older man who lives there represents the past. The younger man represents the future, in a way. He's an engineer, not an architect. And a simple way to see the film is that Marina has to choose between these two basic instincts: death, which is her father, and life, which is the stranger. Dying man, younger man, man who she can't mate with and propagate the species with, a man who she may be able to do that with. But the film is complicated because it's not just a matter of leaving one for another. I think in her own way, Marina honors her father and in some ways consummates that taboo feeling for her father by sending Bella to sleep with him. It's kind of like sleeping with him by proxy, whether she knows that she's doing that or not. It's a kind of final thrill for the old guy, and it's a more socially acceptable way of consummating her own taboo feelings. We can talk if you guys agree with that or don't, but it's a weird subplot within the movie that's worth bringing up. And her own choice of this younger man as a partner is hardly a traditional happy ending. As the final shots suggest, and I really like the final shots of this movie, I like how they go on and on and on, but that's my own taste. Some of you may have found it boring and gotten the point already. I like it. The industrial apocalypse of this society is not about to be redeemed or reversed by this couple. The future at the end of this movie is anything but certain. Like, what are they inheriting? Where are they going to go? What have they got going for them? I mean, they're just kind of two people. The society, the landscape around them is still terrifying and broken and blasted and dying. Throughout it all, I think, myself, that Attenberg has a very keen sense of humor, and I think that Tsangari has a nice deadpan visual style. She holds her camera in one place, she holds her camera there for a long time, and she just kind of looks at what's happening and allows the humor of it or the strangeness of it or the beauty of it to kind of reveal itself instead of forcing you how to feel about it. She's really interested in unusual behavior. Marina and Bella's kissing game and their public dance routines sort of suggest this kind of solidarity and defiance. The images of them kind of walking up and down and doing their silly dances are great. It's like kind of two women against the world. They're kind of putting themselves on display, but they're not doing it for anyone else. They're clearly just kind of doing it for themselves. People have interpreted a certain feminist subtext to the movie and to the relationship between them. It's interesting to see a female relationship that isn't defined by kind of competitiveness, except in a way it kind of is, or it does become defined in some ways by a certain competitiveness and envy both ways. But certainly Tsangari is interested in these two women as this kind of unit acting out, playing around and playing games. And you see the same thing between father and daughter when Marina and Spiros are watching the Attenberg documentaries and imitating the animals. And they're kind of liberating themselves by playing around physically. And those scenes are funny to me because the camera just kind of sits there and watches them. And you wonder how much more ridiculous the actors or the characters via the actors are sort of going to be. There's something very exciting about watching it. And there's also something very creepy about watching it. It maybe makes you self-conscious about your own body and your own behavior when you see them doing this. And then there's the sex scenes, which to me are exactly like the scenes where they're watching the nature documentaries. They could almost be scenes from a nature documentary about human beings. This is how human beings mate, and it's very funny and awkward and strange. And that offsets their explicitness. I find those scenes more funny than I do sexy, and I think that that's sort of supposed to be the point. And there's also Marina's final dance for her father to a song by a band called Suicide. I don't know how many of you know the band Suicide. They're a kind of droning industrial rock band. Athina loves them. I should say as a side note that Athina is a weird character because she grew up in Texas and went to university in Texas. So she's Greek through and through, but she wears cowboy hats and kind of talks like she's from Texas. So she's an interesting person that way. It's an odd but perfectly in character choice for her farewell. I like the